The fluorescent lights of the West Bridge Medical Center parking garage hummed a monotonous tune, a counterpoint to the throbbing in Camille's temples. 14 hours. 14 hours of intricate sutures, tense consultations, and the constant, low-grade hum of life and death decisions. She exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that carried the scent of antiseptic and stale coffee. Finally, she murmured, the word barely audible above the whoosh of the automatic doors sliding closed behind her. Dr. Karen Holt, her crisp white coat, still pristine despite the late hour, caught up with her near the elevator. Rough day, Camille. Camille managed a weary smile. You could say that. Double bypass and a ruptured spleen. Ready for a glass of wine and oblivion. Karen chuckled. Sounds like a plan. See you tomorrow. If I survive, Camille joked, pressing the button for the ground floor. The elevator doors opened with a soft ping, and they stepped inside. A wave of cool, night air washed over Camille as she exited the hospital, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled environment she'd just left. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a blurry, shimmering backdrop to the sprawling parking lot. Her silver sedan gleamed under the sodium lamps, a small beacon promising the sanctuary of home. Drive safe, Camille, a passing intern called out, his voice echoing slightly in the near-empty garage. She nodded in acknowledgement, the familiar exhaustion settling back in. Just the thought of the 40-minute drive home made her eyelids heavy. As she reached for her car keys, the jingling metal a small, familiar sound in the vast quiet of the parking lot. A sudden, harsh voice sliced through the stillness. Hold it right there. Camille froze, her hand hovering inches from the door handle. Two police officers, a man and a woman, strode towards her, their expressions grim. The male officer, tall and broad-shouldered, radiated an almost palpable aggression. The female officer, though smaller in stature, mirrored his stern demeanor. A prickle of unease, cold and sharp, ran down Camille's spine. This late, this empty, what could they possibly want? Ma'am, step away from the vehicle, the male officer commanded, his voice tight with suspicion. Confusion warred with a rising tide of irritation. I beg your pardon, she responded, her voice laced with weariness she couldn't completely suppress. This is my car. The male officer's gaze swept over her, taking in her scrubs, her ID badge still clipped to her chest, the exhaustion etched on her face. His expression, however, remained unchanged. We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description, he stated, his tone clipped and accusatory. The absurdity of the situation struck Camille with the force of a physical blow. Stolen? Her car? After a 14-hour shift, this was the last thing she needed. The exhaustion she'd been battling suddenly transformed into a simmering anger. Stolen, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. I assure you, officer, there must be some mistake. The female officer stepped forward, her hand resting on her holster. License and registration, please, she said, her voice devoid of inflection. Camille's mind raced. This was ridiculous. Utterly, preposterously ridiculous. She fumbled for her purse, her fingers clumsy with fatigue. As she pulled out her driver's license and registration, the simmering anger within her began to boil. The sheer injustice of it all, to be accused of stealing her own car after the day she'd had was almost unbearable. Officer, I'm Dr. Camille Anderson, chief surgeon at this hospital, she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. I've just finished a 14-hour shift. I'm hardly in the mood for games. The male officer glanced at her credentials, his expression flickering with something that looked suspiciously like disbelief. He scrutinized her face, her ID, her car, then back at her face again, as if trying to reconcile the image of a respected surgeon with the alleged car thief. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city. Camille could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, a frantic rhythm against the backdrop of the still night. Suddenly, the automatic doors of the hospital hissed open, spilling light and the sound of concerned voices into the parking garage. A small group of nurses and interns, followed by Dr. Holt and Dr. Sean Wallace, another surgeon, rushed towards them. "What's going on here?" Dr. Holt demanded, her voice sharp with authority. The security guard, alerted by the commotion, also arrived on the scene. "Everything all right, Dr. Anderson?" he asked, his hand hovering near his radio. The sudden appearance of witnesses seemed to momentarily disconcert the officers. The male officer stammered, "We have received a report of a stolen vehicle." Dr. Wallace, his face a mask of disbelief, stepped forward. "Stolen? That's Dr. Anderson's car. She's the chief surgeon." The female officer finally seemed to register the growing crowd and the rising tension. She exchanged a quick, uneasy glance with her partner. The male officer cleared his throat, his earlier aggression replaced by a grudging awkwardness. Well, there seems to have been a misunderstanding," he mumbled, avoiding Camille's gaze. "A misunderstanding?" Camille repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The exhaustion she'd felt moments ago was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. "A misunderstanding that could have landed me in jail. A misunderstanding born out of what exactly, officer?" The male officer shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "We apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be going now." As the officers retreated towards their patrol car, their backs stiff with barely concealed embarrassment, Camille felt a surge of something more than anger, a burning resolve. This wasn't just about a stolen car. It was about something much deeper, something far more insidious. It was about the countless times she'd been judged, underestimated, and disrespected simply because of the color of her skin. And this time, she wouldn't let it go. This time, she would fight back. The hum of the city lights no longer seemed blurry and distant. It felt like a call to action, a promise of change. And Camille Anderson, weary but resolute, was ready to answer. The biting November wind whipped at Camille's scrubs, the chill seeping through the thin fabric. Exhaustion, a familiar weight, settled deep in her bones. 36 hours on call, a successful but complex surgery, and now this. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in the polished black surface of her car, painting an absurd tableau. "License and registration," the male officer repeated, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. Camille's fingers fumbled with her bag, the leather cold against her skin. "License and registration. He's treating me like a common criminal." The thought chafed, a raw, burning sensation in her chest. She could feel the adrenaline, unwelcome and jarring, coursing through her veins. This wasn't the fatigue-induced tremor she was accustomed to. This was anger. Pure, un'adulterante danger. She fished out her wallet, her movements jerky, betraying her inner turmoil. "Stay calm, Camille. Stay calm." The mantra repeated in her head, a fragile shield against the rising tide of indignation. She handed over the documents, her hand brushing against the officer's. His skin felt rough and personal. He scrutinized her license, his brow furrowed. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic thump of her own heart against her ribs. He's looking for something. Anything. Camille knew, with a sickening certainty, what he was looking for. Not evidence of a crime, but confirmation of a prejudice. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he finally said, his tone clipped. The female officer, who had been silently observing, shifted her stance, her hand resting on her holster. A knot tightened in Camille's stomach. "This is ridiculous. I'm in my hospital parking lot, in my scrubs, after saving someone's life, and they're treating me like this." The absurdity of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain even. "Just step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice laced with impatience. Camille hesitated. A flicker of fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her anger. This wasn't a discussion, it was an order. She opened the car door, the metallic click echoing in the sudden stillness. The cold air stung her face. She stood on the asphalt, the harsh glare of the headlights illuminating her. She felt exposed, vulnerable. This is not how I imagined ending my shift. The thought flitted through her mind, a bitter counterpoint to the adrenaline-fueled fear. What the hell is going on? The voice, sharp and demanding, cut through the tense silence. Dr. Karen Holt, her colleague and friend, strode towards them, her face a mask of disbelief. Relief washed over Camille, a wave so potent it almost buckled her knees. She wasn't alone. Behind Karen, a small group of hospital staff had gathered, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. The male officer turned, his expression hardening. "We're conducting an investigation," he said, his tone dismissive. "She's the chief surgeon here. What are you doing?" Karen's voice dripped with authority, echoing the command she often used in the operating room. The female officer finally spoke, her voice hesitant. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description." She gestured vaguely towards Camille's car. Camille felt a surge of fresh anger. "Stolen? They think I stole my own car?" "This is absurd," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "I'm Dr. Camille Anderson. I work here." The male officer scoffed. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he muttered under his breath, but Karen heard him. "And you clearly don't know who she is," Karen retorted, her voice laced with ice. "Dr. Anderson is the head of cardiothoracic surgery at this hospital. She's saved more lives in a week than you've probably seen in your entire career." A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. The interns, nurses, and even the security guard, usually deferential to law enforcement, were now openly staring at the officers with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Dr. Sean Wallace, another surgeon, joined the group. "I saw Dr. Anderson park her car here just a few hours ago," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We were on call together." The male officer's face flushed, a dark, angry red. He looked from Karen to Sean, then back to Camille. The bravado he had displayed earlier had evaporated, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The female officer shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Look," the male officer finally said, his voice strained, "there's been a misunderstanding." The words felt hollow, inadequate. Camille stared at him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. A misunderstanding? This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a blatant act of racial profiling. The thought, stark and undeniable, settled deep within her, a seed of something hard and unyielding. "Save it," Camille said, her voice low and steady. The exhaustion she had felt earlier had been replaced by a different kind of weariness, a weariness born of years of subtle slights and blatant injustices. "I want her badge numbers and your supervisor's contact information." The male officer hesitated, his jaw clenched. He glanced at his partner, who looked equally uncomfortable. The pressure from the hospital staff, their silent but unwavering support for Camille, was palpable. He finally relented, pulling out a small notebook and scribbling down the information. He handed it to Camille without a word, his gaze averted. As the police car pulled away, its flashing lights receding into the darkness, Camille took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. The hospital staff surrounded her, a wall of support against the lingering chill of the encounter. Karen put a hand on her arm, her touch warm and reassuring. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Camille looked at her colleagues, their faces etched with worry and anger. She looked at the hospital, its brightly lit windows a beacon against the night. "This is my hospital. These are my people." A new kind of resolve, steely and determined, began to take root within her. This incident, this blatant injustice, was not just a personal affront. It was a symptom of a larger disease, a systemic racism that permeated every facet of society. And she, Dr. Camille Anderson, was no longer willing to be a silent victim. "I'm fine," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But we need to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The fight, she knew, had just begun. The biting chill of the November air gnawed at the exposed skin of Camille's neck. The crisp white coat, usually a source of professional pride, offered little warmth against the encroaching darkness. The sodium vapor lamps cast long, skeletal shadows across the asphalt, transforming the familiar parking lot into something alien and unsettling. The lingering scent of antiseptic clung to her like a second skin, a stark reminder of the 12-hour shift she'd just endured. A throbbing headache pulsed behind her eyes, a dull counterpoint to the frantic hammering of her heart. Just moments ago, she'd been pinned against the cold metal of her own car, the accusatory glare of the male officer burning into her. Now, the same officer stood before her, cap in hand, mumbling an apology. "We made a mistake, ma'am. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." The words felt hollow, devoid of genuine remorse. They hung in the frigid air like frozen breath, quickly dissipating into nothingness. Camille stared at him, her expression unreadable. Inwardly, a storm raged. Inconvenience? Was that all it was? An inconvenience, like a delayed flight or a spilled coffee. This wasn't about inconvenience. This was about the presumption, the casual disregard for her dignity, the ingrained prejudice that saw her, a black woman in a luxury car, and automatically labeled her a criminal. "Do you really think that's enough?" The words escaped her lips before she could stop them, laced with an icy composure that belied the turmoil within. She saw a flicker of annoyance cross the officer's face, quickly masked by a forced professionalism. "Ma'am, we've apologized. We were responding to a report of stolen vehicle matching the description of yours." Camille's jaw clenched. "You didn't do your job. You didn't bother to ask. You saw my skin, you saw my car, and you jumped to conclusions." The female officer, who had remained silent until now, shifted uneasily. Her gaze darted between Camille and her partner, a subtle dance of discomfort. Camille recognized the look. It wasn't remorse. It was the anxious awareness of being caught, the desire to escape the uncomfortable spotlight. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the flashing lights and the raised voices. Nurses and interns, still in their scrubs, huddled together, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and anger. Dr. Karen Holt, her mentor and friend, stood at the forefront, her arms crossed, her expression unwavering. Dr. Sean Wallace stood slightly behind her, the same sense of shocked disbelief on his face as on the others. The security guard, a young man named Marcus, hovered nervously nearby, his hand resting on his radio. Camille felt a surge of something akin to gratitude for their presence, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience. They had seen it. They understood. The silent witnesses to a scene that played out far too often. The apology, forced and insincere, was not for her. It was for the audience, for the growing number of eyes that now bore witness to their misconduct. The male officer cleared his throat. "Again, ma'am, we apologize for any distress this may have caused. We'll be on our way now." He turned to leave, pulling his partner with him. As they retreated towards their patrol car, Camille's voice, clear and steady, cut through the night. "This isn't over." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The officers didn't turn back. The red and blue lights of the patrol car faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence even more profound than the sirens that had preceded it. Camille took a deep breath, the cold air burning in her lungs. The exhaustion she had felt earlier was replaced by a simmering anger, a slow burn that threatened to consume her. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black doctor, every black professional, every black person who had been subjected to this kind of humiliating scrutiny, this casual assumption of guilt. It was about the countless times she'd been followed in stores, questioned about her credentials, treated with suspicion simply because of the color of her skin. A wave of nausea washed over her. The weight of it all, the accumulated burden of years of microaggressions and outright racism, pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Karen Holt stepped forward, her hand resting gently on Camille's arm. "Are you all right, Camille?" The concern in her voice was genuine, a balm to the raw wound of injustice. Camille managed a weak smile. "I will be." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Something had shifted within her, a fundamental realignment of her understanding of the world she inhabited. The incident in the parking lot was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive disease. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she could no longer remain silent. The faces of her colleagues, a silent chorus of support and shared outrage, reflected her own dawning realization. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs too. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the shared understanding of a battle yet to be fought. The fight for respect, for dignity, for the simple right to exist without fear or prejudice. The long, arduous journey towards justice had just begun. The antiseptic scent of the hospital, a smell Camille usually found comforting, now felt suffocating. The fluorescent lights hummed, a dull throb against the silence of her office. Her reflection in the darkened window pane showed a stranger eyes shadowed, lips pressed thin, a stark contrast to the composed surgeon who just hours ago held a life in her hands. She ran a hand over her face, the coolness of her skin a small comfort against the burning anger still simmering beneath. The parking lot incident replayed in her mind, a cruel loop of flashing lights, accusatory voices, the palpable disbelief in their eyes when she'd shown her ID. My ID, the thought echoed, bitter and sharp. Proof of her identity, her credentials, her years of dedicated service, reduced to a meaningless piece of plastic in the face of their prejudice. The casual dismissal, the assumption of guilt, the sheer audacity of it all pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. This is what it feels like to be invisible and seen at the same time, she thought, the irony of fresh sting. A soft knot broke through her reverie. Camille, Dr. Karen Holt's voice, laced with concern, filtered through the door. Relief, fragile and tentative, unfurled within her. Karen was more than a colleague. She was a confidant, a friend who understood the unspoken burdens they carried as Black women in a world designed to diminish them. Camille pushed herself away from the window, the movement stiff and hesitant. Come got in. Karen entered, her gaze immediately settling on Camille. The concern deepened in her eyes, mirroring Camille's own internal turmoil. I heard what happened, she said softly, closing the door behind her. Are you all right? The simple question unleashed a torrent of emotions Camille had been desperately trying to suppress. The carefully constructed wall of composure crumbled. I don't know if I'm okay, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The admission felt like a crack in the armor she'd worn for so long, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself. Karen crossed the room, her hand finding Camille's shoulder in a gesture of silent support. The warmth of the touch, the unspoken understanding, anchored Camille in the present, reminding her she wasn't alone. It's okay to not be okay, Karen murmured, her voice a soothing balm against the raw edges of Camille's emotions. Let it out. But the tears refused to come. The anger was a hard knot in her stomach, blocking the release of grief. It's just, Camille began, her voice choked, I'm so tired. Tired of having to prove myself. Tired of being judged. Tired of being afraid. Each word was heavy, laden with the weight of years of accumulated microaggressions, the constant pressure to be flawless, to be twice as good, just to be seen as equal. Karen squeezed her shoulder gently. I know, she whispered, the two simple words encompassing a shared history of unspoken struggles. A long silence settled between them, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights. Finally, Karen pulled back slightly, her gaze steady and resolute. What's next? She asked, her voice firm yet gentle, prompting Camille to look beyond the immediate pain. The question hung in the air, a challenge, a demand for action. Camille stared at her hands, the lines etched into her palms a testament to years of hard work, years of striving for excellence, years of pushing against the invisible barriers that society had erected. What's next? The question resonated deep within her, igniting a spark of defiance. She could choose to swallow the injustice, to retreat into the safety of silence, to maintain the fragile peace she'd carved for herself. Or she could fight. We make sure it doesn't happen again, Camille said, the words slow but steady, each syllable infused with a newfound resolve. She looked up at Karen, her gaze locking with her friend's. "We speak up." A flicker of admiration crossed Karen's face. "That's right," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We speak up." The decision, once made, solidified within Camille, hardening into a steely determination. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a burning sense of purpose. She thought of all the other black doctors, nurses, staff, patients who had likely faced similar indignities, their voices silenced, their experiences brushed aside. This wasn't just about her anymore. "I'm going to speak out," Camille declared, the words resonating in the quiet office, a declaration of war against the insidious, pervasive racism that had infected the very institution meant to heal. A wave of fear washed over her, quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. The potential consequences flashed through her mind, the whispers, the backlash, the potential damage to her career. But the thought of staying silent, of allowing this injustice to stand unchallenged, was more terrifying. Karen nodded, her expression a mixture of concern and unwavering support. "It won't be easy," she warned, her voice soft but firm. "The board won't like it." Camille knew what Karen meant. The hospital board, a predominantly white, male group, prioritized image and reputation above all else. Speaking out would undoubtedly ruffle feathers, potentially jeopardizing her position, her hard-earned respect. But the thought of their disapproval, of their potential retaliation, paled in comparison to the burning injustice that gnawed at her soul. "I know," Camille said, her voice unwavering. "But I have to." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the risks involved. The fluorescent lights continued their monotonous hum, a steady backdrop to the momentous decision that had just been made. Camille took a deep breath, the antiseptic air filling her lungs, a stark reminder of the environment she was about to challenge. The battle had begun. The muted hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed in Camille's ears, a stark contrast to the cacophony that had been her life for the past few days. Her office, once a sanctuary of quiet contemplation and focused work, felt like a fishbowl. Every email notification, every hushed phone call from her assistant, every flicker of movement in the hallway outside her closed door felt like an intrusion. She ran a hand over her face, the exhaustion settling deep in her bones. It wasn't just the physical tiredness from the relentless schedule of a chief surgeon. It was a weariness of the soul. She thought she'd prepared herself for the aftermath, the inevitable ripples in the pond after the stone had been thrown. But the reality of the media storm, the public dissection of her life, the insidious whispers within the hospital walls had been more overwhelming than she'd anticipated. Her phone vibrated, a message from Karen Holt flashing across the screen. "They're here. Boardroom. Now." A knot tightened in Camille's stomach. She knew this was coming. The initial outpouring of support, the online hashtags, the news articles praising her courage, they had all been a fleeting comfort against the inevitable institutional pushback. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her white coat, a gesture that felt both automatic and strangely defiant. "They want me to cower. They want me to disappear." The thought flickered through her mind, a spark of anger igniting in the embers of her fatigue. She picked up the folder containing her meticulously prepared statement, the words a shield against the storm brewing within her. "I won't." The mahogany table of the boardroom gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, reflecting the faces of the men and women seated around it. Faces she knew, faces that had smiled at her, congratulated her on her accomplishments, faces that now held an unnerving mix of apprehension and thinly veiled disapproval. Sean Wallace sat beside her, a silent pillar of support in the tense silence of the room. His presence, though comforting, did little to quell the rising tide of unease that washed over her. This isn't about patient care. This isn't about the oath we took. This is about damage control. The realization settled heavy in her chest. "Camille, you need to be ready for this," Mr. Harrison, the hospital CO, began, his voice carefully neutral. His words hung in the air, each syllable pregnant with unspoken meaning. Camille met his gaze, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Ready for what?" Mr. Harrison, to be reprimanded for being the victim of racial profiling. Her voice was steady, controlled, belying the turmoil churning within her. She could feel Sean stiffen beside her, a subtle shift in his posture that spoke volumes. "They want your side of the story, Camille," Mrs. Davies, the head of PR, interjected, her voice laced with a forced calm that grated on Camille's nerves. "And it's getting ugly." The implication hung heavy in the air. Ugly for whom, Mrs. Davies? Ugly for the hospital's reputation, or ugly for me? The question remained unspoken, swirling in the silence that followed. "They're worried about the hospital's image," Mr. Harrison continued, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Camille's shoulder. The words, though carefully chosen, landed like a blow. "Fis incidentis generating a lot of negative publicity. We need to contain the situation." Contain the situation? The phrase echoed in Camille's mind, a chilling reminder of the institution's priorities. Contain the victim, silence the voice, erase the injustice. The unspoken words felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. "Contain it how, Mr. Harrison?" Camille asked, her voice laced with ice. Her gaze swept around the table, taking in the carefully composed expressions, the averted gazes, the subtle fidgeting. She saw not allies, but a collective holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. "We've been reviewing your caseload, Camille," Mr. Harrison began, his voice taking on a tone of strained professionalism. "And we feel that, given the current circumstances, it might be best to reassign some of your responsibilities." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Reassign? Camille felt a surge of disbelief, a wave of anger so intense it threatened to consume her. "Reassign me for what?" "Standing up for myself." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the carefully constructed facade of the room. "For being a victim of racial profiling? Is that the message you want to send, Mr. Harrison? That we silence our doctors when they speak out against injustice?" The words tumbled out, fueled by a righteous anger that she could no longer contain. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their carefully composed masks beginning to crack. Sean placed a hand on her arm, a silent plea for calm. But Camille couldn't be silenced. She'd spent her life building a career, earning respect, fighting for her patients. She wouldn't be reduced to a pawn in their public relations game. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every doctor of color, every nurse, every staff member who had ever felt the sting of prejudice, the weight of systemic injustice. This was about a system that prioritized its image over the well-being of its people. And she wouldn't be complicit in its perpetuation. This meeting, this attempt to silence her, had become something more. It had become a turning point, a catalyst. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this fight had just begun. The fluorescent lights of her office hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony that had played out just hours earlier in the parking lot. Camille sat at her desk, the smooth, cool surface a stark contrast to the burning embers of anger still smoldering within her. She stared at the framed diplomas on her wall, each a testament to years of relentless dedication, each now mocking her with a silent question. Was it all for this? To be reduced to a suspect, a statistic in the very place where she dedicated her life to healing? The bitter taste of injustice coated her tongue. Sean shifted uncomfortably in the chair opposite her, the leather creaking under his weight. His normally jovial face was etched with concern. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the otherwise silent room. "Camille," he began, his voice low, a stark contrast to the booming laughter they often shared in the operating room. "I just spoke with the board." She didn't need to be told. The board. The guardians of the hospital's pristine image, always prioritizing polished appearances over messy truths. She could almost smell the antiseptic scent of their sanitized boardroom, the air thick with unspoken rules and carefully crafted pronouncements. They're suggesting a temporary reassignment. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. A reassignment. a polite way of saying they wanted her out of the spotlight, a scapegoat offered up to appease the ever-watchful eyes of public opinion. Her hand instinctively clenched around a pen, the smooth metal digging into her skin, a small, sharp pain that grounded her in the present. Temporary, she thought, the word a bitter pill. A temporary exile for daring to be a victim. Reassignment to where? She finally asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the turmoil brewing within. He averted his gaze, his discomfort palpable. They haven't finalized it yet. Something administrative, perhaps. Less patient-facing. Less patient-facing. As though her very presence was now a liability. A stain on the hospital's carefully curated image of sterile perfection. She could hear her own heartbeat, a steady drum against the rising tide of anger. The board saw a problem to be managed, a PR crisis to be neutralized. They didn't see a person, a colleague, a surgeon who poured her heart and soul into her work. They think they can silence me, she thought, the realization crystallizing into a cold, hard certainty. They think they can brush this under the rug like it never happened. She looked at Sean, his face a canvas of conflicted emotions. He was a good man, a brilliant surgeon, but trapped within the same system that was now trying to suffocate her. He wanted to help, she knew that, but he was also afraid, bound by the unspoken rules of the institution. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the silence stretching into an eternity. "Tell them," she finally said, each word measured, precise like a scalpel making an incision. Her voice, though quiet, resonated with an unexpected force, the quiet fire within her finally igniting. "Tell them I refuse." Sean flinched as if struck. "Camille," he pleaded, his voice laced with genuine concern. This isn't worth it. They're powerful people. They can make your life very difficult." She met his gaze, her own unflinching. "My life," she replied, her voice now laced with steel, "has already been made difficult. Not by them, but by what they represent. By the system that allows this to happen again and again." She thought back to the faces of the nurses who had rushed to her defense, the security guard who had stood his ground against the officers, the interns who had witnessed the whole ordeal, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for them, for every person who had ever been unjustly targeted, marginalized, silenced. "I'm not letting this go, Sean," she stated, her voice unwavering. "Not now. Not ever." The silence returned, heavier now, charged with a different kind of energy. It was no longer the silence of discomfort, but the silence of resolve, of a line drawn in the sand. He knew, in that moment, that she wouldn't be swayed. He saw it in the fire in her eyes, in the set of her jaw, in the unwavering strength that radiated from her very core. He finally nodded, a slow, reluctant acceptance. "I understand," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I'll tell them." As he rose to leave, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, a constant, insistent reminder of the institutional machine that she was about to challenge. But Camille didn't flinch. She sat there, resolute, a lone figure in the sterile confines of her office, the embers of anger now transformed into a steady flame, a beacon of defiance in the gathering darkness. She had a long road ahead, she knew. But for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of purpose, a sense of clarity. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now overshadowed by something stronger, something deeper, a burning determination to fight, not just for herself, but for a future where the sterile silence of injustice would finally be broken. The mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a vast expanse reflecting the strained faces gathered around it. Camille's reflection stared back at her, a stranger in a crisp white coat, the stark contrast of the fabric against her skin a constant reminder of the battle she was waging. Her hands, usually steady with a scalpel, trembled slightly in her lap. The antiseptic scent of the boardroom, so familiar, now carried the metallic tang of blood, not the physical kind, but the slow, corrosive bleed of injustice. She'd scrubbed in for countless surgeries, faced life and death decisions with unwavering resolve. But this felt different. This was a surgery on the soul of an institution, and the patient was barely clinging to life. Dr. Anderson, thank you for joining us. The chairman's voice, smooth as polished granite, grated on her nerves. He offered a conciliatory smile, the kind reserved for damage control, not genuine empathy. Camille met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. Inside, a storm raged. She saw not just the chairman, but the two officers, their sneering faces imprinted on her memory. The cold metal of the handcuffs against her wrists, the weight of their accusations pressing down on her chest like a lead apron. The humiliation, the raw, burning anger, she swallowed it all, pushing it down to a place where it simmered, a potent fuel for the fight ahead. You've caused quite a stir, Doctor. The chairman's words hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusation. Camille's jaw tightened. A stir? Was that what they called it? A ripple in their carefully controlled pond of privilege? We need to address this situation, he continued, his tone carefully neutral, as if discussing a budget overrun, not the blatant racial profiling of their chief surgeon. Address it. Camille's voice, though quiet, carried an undeniable steel. She allowed a flicker of her anger to surface, just enough to let them know she wasn't intimidated. Her internal monologue mocked her. Address it? As if a carefully worded press release could erase the trauma, the indignity, the deep-seated rot that permeated their institution. She thought of Karen, of Sean, of the nurses and interns who had stood by her, their faces a mosaic of shock and support. Their solidarity was the only balm on the raw wound of that night. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding her gaze. The female board member, the one who championed the hospital's diversity initiatives, a hollow performance. Camille now realized offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. Hypocrisy, Camille thought, it was a disease more virulent than any she'd encountered in the operating room. Dr. Anderson, we understand your frustration. Another board member interjected, his voice laced with condescension. But these things happen. Misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. The word echoed in Camille's mind, a cruel mockery of the truth. A misunderstanding was forgetting someone's name, not being handcuffed and interrogated in your own hospital parking lot because of the color of your skin. I'm not apologizing for telling the truth, Camille stated, her voice unwavering. The chairman's smile finally faltered. The carefully constructed mask of composure slipped, revealing a glimpse of the steel beneath. You're walking a dangerous line, Doctor, he warned, his voice low and menacing. This could cost you everything. Everything. Camille's mind raced. Her career, her reputation, the life she had painstakingly built. She thought of the countless hours she'd poured into her work, the sacrifices she'd made, the patients whose lives she'd touched. Was it all worth risking? A deep breath steadied her. Yes, it was. Because the truth, the raw, unvarnished truth, was worth more than anything they could ever offer her. Because the truth, she replied, her voice resonating with conviction, is worth more than anything you could ever offer me. A heavy silence descended upon the room, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. The chairman, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, finally broke the silence. We've reviewed the security footage, he admitted, his tone grudging. There seems to have been a lapse in judgment on the part of the officers. A lapse in judgment. Camille almost laughed. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a systemic failure, a cancer that had metastasized within the very fabric of society. She saw a flicker of genuine remorse in the eyes of one of the younger board members, a sliver of hope in the otherwise bleak landscape. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of real change. We are prepared to issue a formal apology, the chairman continued, his voice regaining its smooth cadence. And we are committed to implementing a series of diversity and inclusion training programs for all hospital staff, including security personnel. Camille listened, her mind racing. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. A small victory in a war that was far from over. She knew the fight wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, pushback, attempts to silence her. But she was ready. The fire that had been ignited within her that night in the parking lot burned bright, fueled by a righteous anger and an unwavering commitment to justice. She wouldn't be silenced. She wouldn't back down. She would fight, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been marginalized, dismissed, or unjustly accused. The surgery on the institution's soul had just begun, and Dr. Camille Anderson was determined to see it through. The sterile scent of antiseptics still clung to Camille's skin, a constant reminder of the night that had fractured something within her. Weeks had bled into one another, each day a blurry tapestry of whispered conversations, stolen glances, and the weight of unspoken expectations. The hospital, her sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Every corridor echoed with the residue of that night in the parking lot, the harsh glare of the flashlight, the officer's disbelieving sneer. Sleep had become a luxury she could scarcely afford, her mind relentlessly replaying the humiliation, the fear, the simmering rage that threatened to consume her. She'd spent years carefully constructing a wall around her emotions, a necessary shield in the cutthroat world of surgery. But the officer's words, laced with casual prejudice, had chipped away at its foundation, exposing the raw vulnerability beneath. The initial wave of support from her colleagues had been a balm, a fragile raft in a turbulent sea. Dr. Karen Holt, her sharp eyes filled with a quiet understanding, had been a constant presence, her hand a reassuring squeeze on Camille's shoulder during the hospital board's lukewarm investigation. The nurses, her silent army, had rallied around her, their voices a low hum of indignation in the break room. Even some of the patients, their faces etched with worry, had offered words of comfort, their concern a testament to the respect she had earned. But support came with its shadow criticism. Whispers followed her down the halls, some veiled, some not so much. The hospital board, concerned with image above all else, had offered a carefully worded apology, more concerned with damage control than genuine remorse. Their thinly disguised warnings about professionalism and avoiding unnecessary controversy rang hollow in her ears. The pressure to remain silent, to swallow the injustice and move on, was immense. Yet, with each passing day, the thought of compliance choked her. She found herself drawn to the faces of her patients, particularly those of color. She saw a reflection of her own experience in their eyes, the subtle apprehension, the guarded hope. She recalled a young black intern, his shoulders slumped as he recounted a patient's dismissive comment about his abilities. The exhaustion etched on his face mirrored her own. It was in these moments, in the shared burden of their experiences, that Camille felt a shift within her. The exhaustion began to morph into something else, a slow-burning ember of resolve. One afternoon, Dr. Holt found Camille staring out the window of her office, the city sprawling beneath them like a concrete tapestry. Karen's voice was gentle, tinged with concern. "Camille, you've barely slept. You need to rest." Camille turned, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "I can't, Karen. Not yet." Her voice was quiet, but the steel in it was undeniable. "This isn't just about me anymore." Karen nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I know." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You've got the backing of the right people here. The nurses, the interns, even some of the attending physicians. They're ready to stand with you." Camille's heart clenched. The weight of their support, the trust they had placed in her, was almost unbearable. She thought of the countless microaggressions, the subtle slights, the systemic barriers that they faced every day. The quiet dignity with which they carried their burdens filled her with a sense of responsibility, a need to do more than just endure. "It's terrifying," Camille admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen's hand rested on Camille's arm, a silent reassurance. "I know, but it's necessary." The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But it was overshadowed by something else of fierce determination, a refusal to be silenced. The incident in the parking lot had been a catalyst, a spark that ignited a fire within her. She had spent years meticulously building her career, her reputation, her life. Now, she was willing to risk it all, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of prejudice, the weight of injustice. The hospital board, the police department, the city, they would all hear her voice. This was no longer about getting home and resting. This was about changing the system, one scalpel sharp word at a time. The fight had just begun. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of beeping machines and hurried footsteps that usually filled West Bridge. Camille walked beside Karen Holt, her footsteps echoing in the relative quiet. The incident in the parking lot, the raw humiliation, the biting chill of the night air clinging to her skin like a second shadow, it all felt surreal, a dissonant chord in the otherwise predictable rhythm of her life. Just hours ago, she'd been focused on the delicate dance of a triple bypass, her world narrowed to the steady pulse of a heart monitor. Now, her own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anger and disbelief. Karen's hand rested on her arm, a silent offering of support. Camille felt a flicker of warmth at the gesture, a small ember against the encroaching cold. "You shouldn't have to go through this, Camille," Karen said, her voice low, the words weighted with a shared understanding. "No one should." Camille's throat felt tight, a knot of unshed tears threatening to unravel. She swallowed, the movement rough, and managed a small nod. "Shouldn't have to." The words resonated, echoing the weary mantra she'd carried for so long. How many times had she swallowed her anger, smoothed down the edges of injustice, just to keep the peace, to maintain the facade of professionalism? But the veneer had cracked, shattered by the blatant prejudice of those officers. This wasn't just about a stolen car. It was about being seen, truly seen beyond the color of her skin, beyond the assumptions that clung to her like a shroud. They reached a deserted waiting area near the end of the hallway, the plastic chairs gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Camille sank onto one, the sterile chill seeping through her scrubs. She closed her eyes, the image of the officer's sneering face flashing behind her eyelids. Suspect. The word hung heavy, a poisoned dart lodged deep within her. "I still can't believe they," Camille started, her voice trailing off, the words inadequate to express the roiling emotions within her. "I know." Karen squeezed her arm gently. "The way they spoke to you like you were some common criminal." The anger flared again, hot and sharp. Common criminal. She, Dr. Camille Anderson, chief of surgery, a woman who dedicated her life to saving others, reduced to a stereotype, a statistic. "It's not right, Camille, and it's not going to stand." Karen's voice had a steely edge now, a resolve that resonated with Camille's own burgeoning defiance. She opened her eyes, met Karen's steady gaze. "What can we even do?" she asked, the question a whisper of despair laced with a thread of hope. Karen leaned forward, her expression serious. "We fight back," she said, the words sharp and clear. "We don't let them sweep this under the rug." Camille's heart skipped a beat. Fight back? Against whom? The ingrained prejudice, the institutional inertia, the comfortable complacency? The thought was daunting, terrifying, but also exhilarating. A spark of something akin to hope ignited within her, fragile yet persistent. But how? The question was a plea, a yearning for a path forward. "The board wants to meet with you tomorrow," Karen said. "They're worried about the hospital's reputation, about bad press." A bitter laugh escaped Camille's lips. Reputation. Always about reputation. As if her humiliation, her trauma, were mere collateral damage in their pursuit of pristine public image. They think they can smooth this over with an apology, a slap on the wrist for those officers, Karen continued, her voice laced with disgust. "They think we'll just forget, move on." Camille shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement. No, she wouldn't forget. She couldn't. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had been unjustly targeted, every voice silenced by fear or indifference. "I stand with you, Camille," Karen said, her voice unwavering. "I I won't let them silence you. The warmth of Karen's words spread through Camille's chest, thawing the icy grip of fear. She wasn't alone. This small, quiet moment of solidarity felt like a lifeline, a promise of shared strength. If the board wants to question your position here, Karen continued, her eyes flashing with a fierce determination, then maybe it's time we question theirs. The words hung in the air, charged with a potent energy. Question their authority. Challenge the status quo. The idea, once unthinkable, now felt like the only possible course of action. A wave of exhaustion washed over Camille, the cumulative weight of years of silent endurance pressing down on her. But beneath the fatigue, something else was stirring, a nascent strength, a fierce resolve. She looked at Karen, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of rebellion. "They want a meeting?" she asked, her voice low, steady. "Let's give them one they won't forget." A ghost of a smile touched Karen's lips. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, no longer a monotonous drone, but a gathering storm. The quiet hallway, once a sanctuary of sterile calm, now felt charged with anticipation, the air thick with the promise of change. The fight had just begun. The mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a vast, polished expanse reflecting the strained faces gathered around it. Camille's fingers traced the rim of her water glass, the cool condensation a stark contrast to the simmering unease in her chest. This room, this table, they had witnessed countless decisions, some life-saving, some less so. Today, it was the stage for a different kind of surgery, one that aimed to excise the deep-seated malignancy of systemic bias. She could almost smell the antiseptic of expectation hanging in the air, sharp and sterile. "Dr. Anderson," the chairman began, his voice carefully neutral, "we've had extensive discussions regarding the incident, and we've come to a decision." Camille's breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary gasp she quickly suppressed. Decision. The word echoed in the hollow spaces of her mind. A decision that could either validate her struggle or bury it deeper under layers of institutional indifference. She held her breath, her gaze steady, unwavering. "Don't react, Camille. Not yet. We understand the gravity of the situation," he continued, his gaze flitting to meet hers before darting away again. The unfortunate miscommunication. Camille's fingers tightened around her glass. Miscommunication? Was that how they were going to frame it? A simple misunderstanding, a casual slip of the tongue? A bitter laugh threatened to escape her, but she swallowed it down, the taste acrid on her tongue. Reflects poorly not only on the individuals involved, but also on the hospital itself. He paused, clearing his throat, and for a fleeting moment, Camille saw a flicker of something akin to genuine regret in his eyes. Or perhaps it was merely the reflection of the overhead lights. "We want to offer our full support moving forward." Support. The word felt hollow, devoid of meaning. Support mid-action, not carefully crafted platitudes. Beside her, Dr. Holt squeezed her hand, a silent gesture of solidarity. Camille drew strength from the contact, the warmth of her colleague's hand a small beacon in the sterile coldness of the room. Karen's presence, a steady, unwavering force, had been her anchor throughout this ordeal. "We've heard the message loud and clear." Another board member chimed in, his tone conciliatory. "We acknowledge that there's room for improvement in our diversity and inclusion practices." Camille's internal monologue was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. They acknowledge. They understand. They offer support. Empty phrases, like balloons inflated with nothing but hot air. She'd heard these pronouncements before, seen them evaporate into thin air like morning mist. "We're committed to implementing mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff, including security personnel," the chairman announced, his voice gaining a measure of conviction. Camille's eyebrows rose slightly. This was something tangible, a concrete step, however small. "Furthermore," he continued, "we're establishing a dedicated task force to review and revise our existing policies to ensure a more inclusive and equitable environment for all." A task force. A sliver of hope pierced through the cynicism that had settled over Camille. Perhaps, just perhaps, this wasn't just damage control. Maybe, beneath the polished veneer of corporate speak, a genuine desire for change was taking root. The meeting stretched on, the details of the proposed initiatives unfolding slowly, meticulously. Camille listened, her mind racing, dissecting every word, every nuance. The board members spoke of cultural competency training, of bias awareness programs, of creating a platform for open dialogue. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, a delicate dance between apology and assurance. Yet, beneath the carefully crafted words, Camille sensed a shift. The initial defensiveness had dissipated, replaced by a cautious acceptance, a grudging acknowledgement of the systemic issues she had brought to light. The incident in the parking lot, the humiliation, the anger had become a catalyst, a fissure in the carefully constructed facade of the institution. As the meeting drew to a close, Camille felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The fight had been long, draining, but it wasn't over. This was not the finish line, but a starting point. The board's apology, their commitment to change, it was a victory, albeit a fragile one. The real work, the arduous task of dismantling ingrained prejudices and building a truly inclusive environment, was still ahead. Leaving the boardroom, Camille paused in the hallway, drawing a deep breath. The sterile scent of the hospital, usually a source of comfort, now carried a faint undertone of something else, something indefinable. The fight had taken its toll, leaving her emotionally raw, exposed. Yet, beneath the weariness, a flicker of resolve burned bright. The incident in the parking lot had been a personal affront, but it had also ignited a fire, a fierce determination to fight not just for herself, but for all those whose voices had been silenced, whose experiences had been dismissed. The fight for systemic change within the institution and beyond had just begun. The biting November wind whipped at Camille's coat, a stark contrast to the sterile, controlled environment she had just left behind. The automatic doors of West Bridge Medical Center sighed, shut behind her, severing her from the antiseptic scent of the hospital and plunging her into the raw, damp air of the city night. She inhaled deeply, the cold of physical shock that somehow cleared the lingering tension that had coiled tight in her chest for weeks. The parking lot was nearly deserted, the sodium vapor lamps casting long, skeletal shadows that danced with the swaying branches of the nearby oak trees. Her reflection in the slick, black asphalt seemed fragmented, a distorted image of the woman she had been just a few months ago. Exhaustion tugged at her, a familiar weight settling deep in her bones. But beneath that fatigue was a tremor of something new. Not quite peace, not yet victory, but a nascent understanding. A clarity. She reached her car, the sleek silver lines reflecting the harsh urban glow. The mere sight of it sparked a flicker of anger, a phantom pain echoing the humiliation of that night. The flashing lights, the accusatory voices, the sheer absurdity of it all, being questioned, suspected, in the parking lot of the hospital where she had poured her life, her skill, her very essence into saving others. The injustice of it all still burned, a slow simmering rage that threatened to boil over even now. But tonight, the anger felt different. It was no longer a wildfire threatening to consume her. It was a controlled burn, a source of heat, a force forging something stronger within her. Unlocking the car, she slid into the leather seat, the familiar scent of the interior a small comfort. She closed her eyes, replaying the events of the past weeks, the initial shock, the righteous indignation, the exhausting battle with the hospital board, the outpouring of support from unexpected corners, the draining media scrutiny. She'd been called a troublemaker, a race baiter, a publicity seeker. Whispers had followed her in the hospital corridors, veiled accusations in the elevator, averted gazes in the cafeteria. The weight of it had been immense, crushing at times. Doubt, like a parasitic vine, had wound its way around her resolve, whispering insidious questions in the quiet hours of the night. Had she gone too far? Was it worth the cost? But then, she would remember the faces. The faces of the young interns, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration. The faces of the seasoned nurses, their expressions etched with a quiet understanding, a shared history of subtle indignities. The face of Karen Holt, her colleague, her friend, who had stood beside her, unwavering in her support, a beacon in the storm. And the faces of strangers, people she'd never met, who reached out with messages of solidarity, stories of their own experiences, a chorus of voices rising in unison against the insidious tide of prejudice. These faces, these voices had fueled her, had given her the strength to keep going when all she wanted to do was retreat, to disappear back into the anonymity of her work. She opened her eyes, the parking lot lights blurring slightly as a wave of exhaustion washed over her. The fight had taken its toll. The sleepless nights, the endless meetings, the constant emotional strain had left her feeling drained, hollowed out. Yet, amidst the weariness, a spark of something else flickered, a quiet sense of accomplishment, a hard-won victory. The hospital board, pressured by the mounting public outcry and the unwavering support she had received from within the hospital and beyond, had finally issued a public apology. They had promised to implement diversity and inclusion training for all staff and to review their internal policies to address systemic bias. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. A faint smile touched her lips. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. The roots of prejudice ran deep, tangled and tenacious, woven into the very fabric of society. Eradicating them would require a sustained, collective effort, a relentless push against the inertia of ingrained biases. It would require vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But she had made a powerful impact. She had shone a light on the darkness, had forced a conversation that had long been avoided. She had become a catalyst for change, a voice for the voiceless. The car engine hummed to life, a low, steady thrum that resonated with the newfound strength within her. As she pulled out of the parking lot, the city lights stretched out before her, a vast, glittering tapestry of human lives, each one carrying its own story, its own struggles, its own hopes. The road ahead was long, the journey arduous, but tonight, she drove not with the weight of exhaustion, but with the lightness of purpose. The fight would continue, but she was ready.